Imagine stepping into a medieval convent in the 1300s. From the outside, it's a fortress of purity, stone walls, solemn chants, and strict silence. But behind those high walls, away from the eyes of men and kings, lived a world no one dared speak of. A world where obedience met temptation, where forbidden touches happened during night prayers, and where women sworn to God whispered secrets that would scandalize even nobles. These weren't just holy sisters, they were human. And the rules that governed their bodies? Far more twisted and contradictory than any outside the cloister would ever know. Before we open the wooden doors and peer into the candle-lit halls of female monasteries, take a moment to subscribe. These aren't just forgotten rituals. We're about to unearth one of the strangest corners of medieval life. And let me know in the comments, which hidden chapter of history do you want next? Most people imagine nuns of the 1300s as passionless, cloaked in silence, locked away from the carnal world. But monasteries were not designed to strip women of desire. They were designed to control it. And that distinction changes everything. Monastic rules like the Benedictine order's rule laid out strict codes for bodily discipline. Silence was seen as a form of purity, and even casual conversations could lead to suspicion. But underneath this, many convents enforced physical separation between nuns not just to protect their vows, but to suppress rising intimacy. Beds were separated by heavy drapes, and nighttime visits were explicitly forbidden. Why such detailed rules? Because violations happened often enough to require them. In fact, silence became a cover for secret behaviors. The rule of silence meant that confessions were rarely shared unless forced. Within these private walls, emotional bonds flourished. And sometimes they grew into something more. The church feared emotional intimacy between women because it blurred the lines of obedience. In several documented cases, young novices were placed under the mentorship of older nuns, and many of these relationships became intense, emotional, and at times sexual. A nun from France confessed in 1321 that her spiritual mentor had introduced her to the pleasures of the spirit, a euphemism later interpreted as mutual physical intimacy cloaked under divine language. It wasn't just personal rebellion, it was theological confusion. Medieval medical theories, heavily influenced by Galenic thought, believed that female desire was natural and dangerous if left unreleased. Monasteries became pressure chambers, with women taught to fear their own thoughts and confess even dreams that strayed from holiness. Many believed that sexual dreams were a sin, but others thought they were demonic attacks, especially when they caused physical pleasure during sleep. This led to the bizarre practice of nocturnal confessions, where nuns reported erotic dreams and physical sensations to their abbess. In some cases, the abbess would respond by enforcing harsh punishment, like cold baths, fasting, or sleeping without blankets. But in others, these confessions only deepened the bond between confessor and superior, giving rise to a strange intimacy cloaked in penance. Despite all this, the public image of nuns remained spotless. Their purity was praised, their voices never questioned. But what happened when that silence hid the sound of temptation? While nobles enforced chastity with metal belts, convents had no such tools. Yet the female monasteries developed their own methods, ones far more psychological and ritualistic. The primary weapon of control? Public confession and bodily shame. If a nun was suspected of touching herself, even involuntarily in sleep, she was required to confess it before the entire convent. These rituals weren't quiet affairs. They were public, humiliating, and sometimes repeated for weeks. The abbess would then prescribe a series of punishments designed to cool the flesh. These included sleeping on bare stone, fasting on bread and water, or even self-flagellation with knotted ropes while chanting penitential psalms. In extreme cases, cold water immersion was ordered, dipping the guilty sister in freezing basins before prayer to silence the desires of the womb. And some abbesses took it further, instructing the nun to lie prostrate outside the chapel overnight, unclothed, as a symbol of surrender. These scenes weren't rare. They were documented, regulated, and in some regions even celebrated by visiting bishops as proof of moral discipline. But here's the contradiction. These punishments often heightened the very sensations they were meant to suppress. Freezing baths left the body hypersensitive. Fasting caused hallucinations. Flagellation, meant to purify, sometimes aroused. Medieval church documents quietly admit that some nuns would volunteer for extra penance, confessing more than they needed. It's unclear whether this was guilt or a hidden appetite cloaked in ritual. Surveillance intensified. In several 14th century English convents, older nuns were assigned as spiritual monitors. These women observed younger sisters at night, checking for movement under sheets, moans during sleep, or even too much closeness during morning prayers. A kiss that lingered too long, a hand brushing hair too gently, such things could trigger an investigation. But nothing terrified church authorities more than the idea of female-female bonds. A bishop's visitation report from 1335 accuses two nuns of sharing a bed thrice weekly and clinging in fondness. The punishment? Isolation in separate wings, no verbal contact for 1 year, and mandatory confession under supervision. Yet despite the crackdown, these connections returned, again and again. Why? Because many women entered the convent young, sometimes as early as age 7. They were raised together, emotionally and spiritually. The outside world was forbidden. For some, love inside the walls wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Ironically, many convents encouraged sisterly affection. Hugging was allowed. Holding hands during chants was seen as unity, and nuns often wrote one another long spiritual letters laced with longing. These blurred boundaries made it impossible to separate sin from companionship. Where did devotion end and desire begin? The church never figured it out. Among the most quietly scandalous elements of 1300s convent life was not what the nuns did, but what they read. Despite restrictions, forbidden texts made their way inside monasteries. Gifted by noble families or smuggled by educated confessors, these books included not only theological commentary, but also medical texts on female anatomy and, most controversially, accounts of ecstatic visions. One such text, The Mirror of Simple Souls, written by Marguerite Porete, was banned and burned by church order. Why? Because it described a soul becoming one with God in a way that mimicked physical intimacy. Lines spoke of entering his presence and dissolving in pleasure. For women isolated from all male contact, the metaphor was anything but innocent. Convent scribes copied these texts late at night, often illuminating the margins with eroticized saints and feminine angels. Some letters uncovered from German nunneries show elaborate fantasies of Christ as a bridegroom, entering the body of a worthy vessel through divine light. Whether this was symbolic or subconscious longing is unclear, but the repeated imagery suggests that these weren't isolated cases. In one case from Italy, a nun's private journal revealed dreams of the Virgin Mary touching her lips to mine and blessing me with fire. The church was baffled. Was this heresy, hallucination, or something darker? The overlap of mysticism and sexuality was dangerous territory. Saint Teresa of Avila's later writings describe her famous angel with a golden spear, who pierced her heart until she moaned aloud in sweetness. Though her visions came centuries later, they mirrored the ecstatic language found in 14th century cloisters. In some convents, nuns created coded languages to share thoughts without confession. These included metaphors like the wine of the bridegroom or night kisses of the Holy Spirit. Even poetry became suspect. Erotic psalms written under the guise of worship spread from nun to nun. When bishops discovered these materials, entire libraries were purged. Some abbesses were excommunicated for allowing the copying of such texts. But the demand never ceased. Women who had no outlet for emotion or touch poured it into metaphor, and often it spilled into passion. Candlelit scriptoriums became places of both discipline and dangerous creativity. Writing became an act of rebellion, and for many, a secret way to touch what they were forbidden to feel. The walls of a monastery weren't always enough to keep the outside world out. Multiple chronicles report cases of pregnancy within convents, sometimes covered up with swift transfers, faked illnesses, or secluded births. In one recorded incident from Avignon, 2 pregnant nuns were discovered and their abbess executed, not for failing to prevent sin, but for failing to contain the scandal. How did it happen? There were many routes: priests assigned for confession, visiting nobles, even lay workers maintaining the grounds. The most infamous were the night confessors, men who arrived at dusk to hear private sins. These encounters were supposed to be chaste, but multiple reports detail inappropriate touch during absolution, and in one case, coerced intimacy behind the altar. Sometimes the line between victim and participant blurred. With no education in consent and power imbalance as the norm, a nun could be both ashamed and complicit. One document from 1314 describes a nun who confessed great sorrow for laying with her confessor, yet declared him chosen by God. But male intrusions weren't always consensual. In more than one case, wealthy families bribed monasteries to take in troubled daughters as a way to hide pregnancies. These girls were often victims of incest or abuse, and their placement in the convent was seen as cleansing. Once inside, their trauma collided with religious dogma, and some became silent mothers, giving birth behind the walls only to have their child removed or buried quietly. The church's response was mixed. In some regions, pregnant nuns were stripped of their veils, declared ex-nuns, and sent to live in poverty. In others, abbesses covered the scandal to protect the convent's reputation. Virginity was tied to divine legitimacy. Without it, even the land grants could be questioned. But the harshest fate awaited those who gave birth and tried to keep the child. One German convent document tells of a nun who attempted to raise her child in secret. When discovered, she was imprisoned in a stone room for life, and the baby disappeared. Yet still, the cycle repeated. The rules weren't failing. They were unrealistic. Medieval convents were never meant to be prisons. They were meant to be sanctuaries, places where women could dedicate their bodies and minds to something beyond the material. But the church misunderstood one thing. Flesh doesn't disappear behind walls. The more women were told to suppress their desires, the more those desires took root in metaphor, in pain, in ritual, in love. The nun who kissed her sister during matins. The one who stayed behind after prayers to weep in silence. The girl who begged Mary to take away her feelings, and the one who wrote them into poetry instead. Many women believed their longing made them evil. Others believed it made them holy. If Christ suffered for love, why couldn't they? Perhaps the most haunting records are the anonymous confessions kept by a 14th century Spanish abbess. In them, she writes, "I have seen in their eyes the struggle between fire and vow. I have heard them weep for a touch they never received. I have punished, and I have envied. We will never know all the stories buried under stone floors and behind oaken doors, but we know this. Convents were not pure. They were human. And in that humanness lies something more terrifying and more beautiful than any sermon could preach. They were women, trapped in a system that demanded impossible control over the most natural part of their being.